The moment I moved into my dream property, I thought I'd finally have peace, until the HOA stormed in. They claimed my lake, my very own lake, was theirs. I froze. Their demands were aggressive, their tone threatening, but they didn't know one thing. One secret that could turn the entire fight in my favor. And as they started telling me what I could and couldn't do, I realized this was bigger than a property dispute. This was about control, power, and who really rules here. What happened next? Let's just say, they weren't prepared for the justice I had waiting. I remember the day I first stepped onto my new property like it was yesterday. I had spent months searching for the perfect home, somewhere quiet, peaceful, with enough space to feel free. When I finally found this place, it had everything I wanted: a small but beautiful lake, tall trees surrounding the property, and a house that felt like it had been built just for me. I imagined mornings walking by the water, evenings watching the sunset, and weekends where nobody could bother me. It was my dream. Moving in felt surreal. The boxes were everywhere, the movers were exhausted, and I was running around trying to make sure everything was set up. My mind was full of plans: planting a garden, fixing up the dock on the lake, and just enjoying a life I'd worked so hard for. But I didn't realize that my dream home came with its own set of rules, and not the kind written on paper for construction or zoning. These were the invisible rules enforced by people who thought they owned the neighborhood, not just their own homes. I first noticed it a few hours after I'd settled in. A car slowly drove down the long gravel driveway. At first, I thought it was a neighbor coming to welcome me, but the look on their faces told me otherwise. The woman at the wheel, let's just call her Karen, had that sharp, judging gaze. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, walking directly toward me as if she owned the place. She was middle-aged, dressed neatly, with a certain coldness in her posture. I could tell immediately she was the type who followed rules for the sake of power, not because they cared about fairness. "Hello," I said cautiously, waving. "Can I help you?" Her smile was thin and forced. "I hope you're aware that this property falls under HOA regulations," she said. "And that includes the lake. There are strict rules about access and usage. We need to discuss them immediately." I froze. My lake. She was claiming rights to my lake. I didn't know what to say at first. I had read the HOA documents when I bought the house, yes, but I had never imagined someone would confront me like this on my very first day. I thought this was my property," I said slowly. "I mean, I bought it. Everything here is mine, right?" Karen's smile didn't waver. "Technically, yes. But there are easements and HOA regulations that give us oversight. We need to ensure everything is in compliance. That includes your dock and the lake area." I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. The dream of peace I had carried for so long now felt fragile, threatened by someone who thought they could intimidate me. And yet, there was something inside me that refused to back down. I had worked hard, researched every legal clause, and understood my rights better than most of the board members. "Okay," I said, trying to sound calm. "Let's sit down and go through the details. I'm happy to comply where it's required." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly, like she was measuring whether I was nervous or ignorant. "I don't think you understand. These rules are not optional. Non-compliance can result in fines, restrictions, and even legal action. We expect full cooperation." At that moment, I realized that this wasn't just about a lake. This was about control. Karen and the HOA had a pattern. They wanted to dictate every inch of your life, make you follow rules that benefited them, and make you feel powerless if you tried to push back. I could feel the tension building in the air. I excused myself politely and went inside to grab my papers. I had all the documents I needed: property deeds, easements, legal clauses, even emails with the HOA that clarified boundaries. I wanted to remain calm, collected, and, most importantly, prepared. I didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but I also knew that ignorance or hesitation would be treated as weakness. When I returned, Karen had already called over 2 other HOA members, as if to reinforce her authority. They all stood there, clipboard in hand, looking down their noses, clearly expecting me to fold. I took a deep breath. "I've reviewed the documents," I said. And while I respect the HOA rules, it's clear that the lake and the dock fall under my control according to the property deeds. I'd like to discuss a solution that doesn't involve unnecessary conflict. Karen's expression tightened. We'll see about that, she said coldly. Because our inspections have noticed several areas of concern. And this is only the beginning. You'll need to comply fully or face consequences. That threat hung in the air like a storm cloud. I could feel my heart racing, but there was also a surge of determination. I had bought this place with my hard-earned money. I had every right to enjoy it. And I wasn't about to let a few overzealous HOA members take that away. For the rest of the day, I stayed alert. I walked the property, checking the boundaries, reviewing documents, and mentally preparing for the next encounter. My neighbors kept their distance, some curious, some wary. I sensed that news would travel fast. HOA drama always did. By the evening, I realized that the dream of peace I had carried for so long was now entangled with a battle. I wasn't sure how long it would last or what tricks they had up their sleeves, but one thing was certain, I wasn't going to be intimidated. I had knowledge, preparation, and the truth on my side. And sometimes, that's more powerful than authority. That night, as I sat by the lake, the water reflecting the orange sunset, I made a silent promise to myself. No matter how many rules they tried to enforce, no matter how aggressive they became, I would protect my property, my lake, and my peace. I didn't yet know how this fight would unfold, but I knew it would test my patience, courage, and strategy. And for the first time, I also realized that this was more than just a property dispute. It was a story about justice, control, and standing up when someone tries to take what's yours. Little did I know, the first visit from the HOA was just the beginning. The next days would push me to the edge, testing every skill I had learned about strategy, negotiation, and keeping calm under pressure. But that first encounter, that first threat, it set the stage for a battle that I would not only survive but use to expose the truth and claim control over my own home. By the end of that night, I sat on the dock, my feet dangling over the water, watching the lake ripple in the cool evening breeze. It was mine, and I was ready to fight for it. The very next morning, I woke up with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. After yesterday's confrontation with Karen and the HOA members, I knew things weren't going to settle quietly. Moving into a dream home was supposed to be peaceful, but this felt more like stepping onto a battlefield. I made myself a cup of coffee, sat by the kitchen window, and watched the morning sunlight hit the lake. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to enjoy the calm. But I knew it wouldn't last long. By mid-morning, the sense of unease became reality. A truck carrying 2 more HOA representatives pulled up the driveway. My heart sank. This wasn't just Karen anymore. They were bringing reinforcements. They walked onto the property with a confident air, clipboards in hand, scanning the area as if they were conducting a full-scale audit. Their presence alone was meant to intimidate, and it worked, at least for a moment. I could feel the tension in the air, thick enough to touch. I greeted them politely, trying to keep my voice steady. "Good morning. Can I help you?" Karen stepped forward, her expression unreadable. "We need to perform a full inspection of the property," she said. "There are multiple areas that need verification regarding the lake, the dock, and compliance with HOA regulations." I nodded slowly, keeping my composure. "Of course," I said. "Why don't you follow me, and I'll show you everything you need." As we walked along the property, I could feel my adrenaline rising. Every word they said seemed loaded with hidden threats. Every glance toward the lake felt like a challenge. But I had anticipated this. I knew that the HOA relied heavily on fear and confusion. Most homeowners would see a group of people with clipboards and assume they were powerless to resist. But I had read the bylaws, the easements, and the property deeds multiple times. I knew exactly where I stood. They started asking questions, some reasonable, some clearly designed to unsettle me. "Who authorized this dock?" one of the new members asked, as if I had built it without permission. "Are you aware that certain activities on the lake require HOA approval?" I took a deep breath and responded carefully. "According to the property deed, the dock and lake are part of my ownership. The HOA does not have jurisdiction here, and there is no clause requiring additional approval for personal use. There was a brief pause. I could see Karen's frustration behind her calm exterior. I could almost hear the gears turning in her head, trying to figure out how to assert control despite the clear legal boundaries. The other members murmured to each other, probably looking for a loophole I had missed. But there wasn't one. Despite my calm, I could feel my blood pressure rising. The audacity of showing up on my property, acting like they owned it, was infuriating. And yet, I reminded myself that losing my temper would be exactly what they wanted. This was a psychological game as much as it was a legal one. I needed patience, strategy, and documentation. Over the next hour, they walked the property with me, inspecting every corner, every inch of the dock, and even peering at the water as if trying to find some violation. They made notes on their clipboards, took pictures, and occasionally exchanged whispers. All the while, I stayed calm, explaining my understanding of the rules and gently correcting any misconceptions. I could see that my confidence was starting to frustrate them. Finally, Karen stopped near the edge of the lake. "We'll be filing a report," she said, her tone sharp. "Non-compliance with HOA rules can result in fines, restrictions, or legal action. You should be prepared." I nodded again, letting a small smile slip. "I've read the rules, and I'm aware of my rights," I said. "I'm confident that everything is in order. But I appreciate you conducting the inspection." As they left, I felt a rush of relief, mixed with adrenaline. The first real test was over, and I had held my ground. But I knew this was just the beginning. Karen and the HOA were not going to give up easily. They were used to controlling people, and I had just made it clear that I wasn't someone they could intimidate. That evening, I decided to take action preemptively. I started setting up a more detailed record of every interaction, every inspection, every conversation with the HOA. I documented times, dates, and details, and even set up cameras in strategic locations, not to spy, but to have evidence in case they tried to escalate further. I also reached out to a local attorney who specialized in property law, just to make sure I was covered. Over the next few days, the tension in the neighborhood was palpable. Some neighbors started whispering about the confrontation. A few came by to introduce themselves, offering support, while others kept their distance, clearly afraid of being associated with the conflict. I realized that HOA drama didn't just affect the person in the middle, it rippled across the entire community, creating an atmosphere of tension and unease. One morning, I received a letter from the HOA. The language was formal, almost threatening, outlining supposed violations and hinting at fines. But I read it carefully, clause by clause, and quickly realized it was full of exaggerations and misinterpretations. I drafted a response, calmly and professionally refuting each point, and sent it back via certified mail. I wanted to make sure there was a paper trail showing that I was cooperative, aware of my rights, and prepared to defend them if necessary. Through it all, I started noticing patterns in the HOA's behavior. Karen would show up at random times, sometimes in the early morning, sometimes in the evening, always trying to catch me off guard. She would ask neighbors questions, subtly trying to gather information that could be used against me. It was exhausting, but I reminded myself that patience was key. They wanted a reaction. They wanted me to make a mistake. And I wasn't going to give them that satisfaction. By the end of the week, I had begun to feel a strange mixture of empowerment and wariness. On one hand, I was confident that I had the knowledge and evidence to protect my property. On the other hand, the persistence of Karen and the HOA reminded me that this was going to be a long, drawn-out battle. Every day brought a new challenge, a new test of patience and strategy. But I also realized something important. I wasn't just defending my lake or my dock. I was standing up against a system of control, against people who thought power gave them the right to intimidate others. And in doing so, I was not only protecting my property, but also asserting my right to live without fear in my own home. That night, I sat again by the lake, watching the water ripple gently in the moonlight. The tension of the past week weighed on me, but I also felt a sense of calm determination. I knew the HOA would come back with new tactics, new challenges, and perhaps even more aggressive moves. But I also knew that I was ready. Knowledge, preparation, and patience were my greatest weapons. And so, part 2 closes with the realization that the battle was far from over. The HOA had made their first moves, testing my boundaries, trying to assert their authority. But I had held my ground, set up defenses, and prepared for whatever came next. This was no longer just a dream of a peaceful lake, it was the beginning of a true fight for control, justice, and respect. By the start of the second week in my new home, it was clear that Karen and the HOA weren't just going to rely on rules and inspections. They had shifted tactics. Now, it was psychological, a battle of intimidation, manipulation, and subtle pressure. I began noticing little things almost immediately, things designed to make me second-guess myself. The first sign came one morning when I stepped outside to check the dock. There, parked conspicuously at the edge of the driveway, was Karen's car again. She wasn't inside, and there were no other HOA members around, but the message was clear: I'm watching. I felt a jolt of unease, but I forced myself to breathe and remind myself that this wasn't about fear, it was about control. And I wasn't going to give her that. Later that day, I noticed neighbors acting strangely. Some avoided eye contact, others whispered to each other as I walked by. It didn't take long to realize that Karen had been talking to them, planting subtle suggestions that I might be difficult or unwilling to cooperate. The HOA had a long-standing reputation in the area, and some neighbors seemed to accept her authority without question. I had to navigate this carefully. Any hint of conflict could give her more leverage. It was during one of these encounters that I felt the real psychological pressure. Karen arrived at the property again, but this time she was smiling, calm, almost friendly. She carried a clipboard and a folder filled with printed documents, each page carefully highlighted. "Good morning," she said warmly. "I just wanted to clarify a few things about your property. Make sure you fully understand the rules before they become a problem." Her tone was deceptively pleasant, but I could feel the subtle threat beneath every word. It was a technique designed to lull me into complacency, make me feel uncertain, and give her the upper hand. I stayed calm, however. "Thank you," I replied. "I've read all the rules carefully and have my own records. But I'm happy to discuss them." She flipped through the pages, pointing to minor details, asking questions that sounded innocent but were actually meant to test my knowledge. "Do you understand that the lake area has restrictions on certain types of structures?" she asked. "Some homeowners have been fined in the past for non-compliance." I smiled politely. "I'm aware of the general rules. Everything on this property falls within my legal rights, including the dock and surrounding area. I'm confident I'm in compliance." Her smile faded for a moment. I could see the shift in her expression, the calculation in her eyes. It was the first time she realized that her usual tactics weren't working. The other HOA members standing behind her exchanged glances, unsure of how to react. But Karen didn't give up. She continued her subtle psychological games, sending letters and emails that were carefully worded to imply non-compliance and suggest potential legal trouble. Each message was designed to unsettle me, but I kept my cool. I printed every letter, saved every email, and documented every interaction meticulously. I realized that evidence would be my shield and my weapon. At this point, I also began to notice patterns in their visits. Karen would often arrive at times I least expected, sometimes just after I returned from errands or early in the morning when I was preparing coffee. She wanted to catch me off guard, make me feel like I was being watched constantly. But I refused to give her that satisfaction. I adjusted my routine, keeping track of times and maintaining my calm. One day, Karen tried a new tactic. She called a neighborhood meeting, inviting several homeowners, including some who had never spoken to me before. Her goal was clear: isolate me, create doubt in the minds of the neighbors, and make it seem as though I was the problem. I attended the meeting, armed with my documents and knowledge of the rules. The meeting started with Karen presenting her version of the rules, highlighting supposed violations by homeowners, including myself. She spoke with confidence, assuming everyone would side with her. But I remained calm, waiting for the right moment. When she mentioned my property, I spoke up, clearly and confidently. "According to the deed and HOA documents, my dock and lake access are fully within my rights. I've reviewed everything thoroughly and have documentation to support my compliance. A few murmurs spread through the room. Some neighbors looked surprised, others looked skeptical, unsure who to believe. Karen tried to regain control, but I noticed that her usual aura of authority was slipping. Her words became sharper, almost defensive. I realized then that my calm and preparation were already starting to work in my favor. After the meeting, Karen tried to approach me privately, attempting to intimidate me one-on-one. "You should reconsider your stance," she said, her tone low and threatening. Fighting the HOA could be costly, stressful, and damaging. I met her gaze steadily. "I've considered it carefully," I said. "I'm fully aware of my rights, and I'm prepared to defend them. I hope we can find a way to resolve this without unnecessary conflict, but I won't be intimidated." Her expression hardened, but she didn't argue further. She realized that I wasn't the type of homeowner who could be bullied or manipulated. Over the next few days, I noticed Karen employing more subtle psychological tactics, leaving notes on my mailbox, sending cryptic emails about compliance deadlines, and occasionally showing up without warning. Each attempt was designed to create stress and uncertainty. But I refused to react impulsively. I documented everything, reviewed the property rules again, and consulted my attorney to ensure I was prepared for any escalation. At the same time, I began to notice an unexpected shift in the neighborhood. Some neighbors started approaching me privately, expressing their support and sharing stories of past conflicts with Karen and the HOA. They had witnessed her manipulations and were relieved to see someone standing up confidently. Their encouragement gave me strength, reinforcing the idea that knowledge and preparation were powerful tools against intimidation. By the end of the week, I had turned the psychological pressure to my advantage. I continued documenting every interaction, maintained my calm, and strategically communicated with both Karen and the neighbors. I realized that the HOA's attempts to manipulate me were only effective if I allowed them to create doubt, fear, or frustration. By staying composed, I was already winning small battles, setting the stage for a larger confrontation that would ultimately expose the HOA's overreach. That week taught me an important lesson. Fighting for your rights isn't just about laws or documents. It's about staying calm under pressure, anticipating manipulation, and turning every challenge into an opportunity to reinforce your position. Karen and the HOA may have tried to control me psychologically, but I was learning how to control the narrative, protect my property, and assert my authority. Sitting by the lake that evening, I reflected on the week's events. The water was calm, reflecting the fading sunlight, and for a moment, I allowed myself a deep breath of relief. The HOA had escalated, tested my knowledge, and tried to undermine my confidence. But I had stayed composed, documented everything, and began to build a quiet network of support among my neighbors. I knew the battle was far from over. Karen would come back with new tactics, new letters, perhaps even legal threats. But I also knew that I was no longer reacting blindly. I was prepared, aware, and confident. The psychological war was intense, but I had learned the rules, and I was ready to play to win. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable by the start of the third week. Karen and the HOA had realized that their psychological tactics alone weren't enough. I could feel it in the way she lingered a little too long near my property, the pointed questions in emails, and the carefully worded letters threatening action. They were moving to a new phase, the direct challenge. It all began with a letter stamped with the HOA seal. The envelope was large, formal, and, to any outsider, intimidating. I opened it carefully and read through it. The language was sharp, almost accusatory. They claimed that my dock, my use of the lake, and even minor landscaping adjustments violated multiple HOA rules. The letter hinted at fines, restrictions, and even potential legal action. It was clear, they were trying to scare me into compliance. I didn't panic. Instead, I carefully analyzed every statement in the letter. I cross-checked it with my property deed, the HOA covenants, and my previous correspondence. Almost every claim was exaggerated, misinterpreted, or outright false. I began drafting a response, one that was firm, polite, and backed by evidence. I included copies of all relevant documents, photos of the property, and citations from the HOA's own rules that supported my position. The day I sent my response, Karen appeared at the property again. She approached slowly, her expression calm but her eyes calculating. "I received your letter," she said, her voice even. "But I think you're underestimating the seriousness of these violations." I met her gaze steadily. "I've reviewed the rules and my property rights carefully," I said. "Everything on this property is compliant with the law and HOA regulations. If there is any misunderstanding, I'm happy to clarify with evidence, as I have already provided in my response." Her smile tightened, and for a brief moment, I could see the frustration behind her composed exterior. "We'll see how that plays out," she said, before walking away. I realized immediately that the battle had shifted into a more aggressive phase. Karen and the HOA weren't just testing boundaries, they were actively trying to provoke a reaction that could be used against me. They wanted me to make a mistake, to respond emotionally, or to ignore the legal requirements so they could escalate further. Over the next few days, the tension escalated. I noticed small but deliberate moves. Someone from the HOA appeared near the lake early in the morning, taking notes and photos. Another member asked questions of my neighbors, subtly suggesting that I was difficult to deal with. It was a campaign of intimidation, designed to make me feel isolated. But I wasn't about to fall into their trap. I had already started keeping meticulous records of every interaction, noting dates, times, and exact statements. I also reached out to my attorney more frequently, reviewing every potential move the HOA could make. I wanted to be prepared for any scenario, letters, fines, or even legal proceedings. Knowledge was my weapon, and preparation was my shield. Then came the turning point. One afternoon, Karen sent an email that was clearly meant to provoke me. She claimed that if I did not remove certain items from the lake and dock area, the HOA would initiate formal proceedings and impose fines retroactively. The language was aggressive, bordering on threatening. I read the email carefully, noting the tone, the claims, and the implied consequences. Instead of reacting immediately, I took a step back and planned my next move. I drafted a calm, professional response, refuting every claim with evidence. I included photographs, legal references, and documentation showing that my property improvements and lake use were fully compliant. I sent the email certified, ensuring there was a clear record of my response. The next morning, Karen appeared at my door again. This time, she was accompanied by 2 other HOA representatives. I could tell immediately that they intended to escalate matters directly on my property. "We received your email," Karen said, her tone clipped. "But this doesn't change our position. We believe there are violations that must be addressed immediately." I invited them in, keeping my tone calm and measured. "I understand your concerns, and I've provided all the documentation necessary to clarify any misunderstandings," I said. "If there are specific issues you want to discuss, we can go through them point by point, using the records I've provided." As we walked around the property, I explained the reasoning behind every improvement, every dock placement, and every landscaping choice. I showed them the survey documents, the property deed, and photos that clearly demonstrated compliance. I could see the surprise on their faces. They had expected a homeowner intimidated by their threats, but instead, they were met with clarity, preparation, and confidence. Despite this, Karen tried one final tactic during the visit. She subtly questioned my neighbors, asking if they had noticed anything unusual or non-compliant. Her goal was clear, to gather evidence that could support a claim against me. But I had already anticipated this. I had spoken with supportive neighbors, explained the situation, and ensured that any casual conversation would not be twisted against me. By the end of the day, it was clear that Karen and the HOA were frustrated. Their usual tactics of intimidation, letters, and surprise visits were not producing the desired effect. I had remained calm, documented everything meticulously, and had the support of the law and a few key neighbors on my side. That night, as I sat by the lake, I reflected on the events of the past week. The battle had shifted from subtle intimidation to a direct challenge, but I had handled it without losing composure. I realized that preparation, patience, and knowledge were more powerful than aggression or threats. The HOA could try to control the situation, but I had the upper hand in the one area that truly mattered, the facts. I knew, however, that this was just the beginning. Karen and the HOA would not give up easily. Their next moves could be more aggressive, more public, and possibly involve legal actions. But I also knew that by staying calm, methodical, and prepared, I could continue to protect my property, my lake, and my peace of mind. That night, as the stars reflected off the calm surface of the lake, I made a quiet promise to myself: I would not be intimidated. I would not let fear or manipulation dictate my actions. This battle wasn't just about the lake or the dock, it was about standing up for my rights, maintaining control over my home, and ensuring that justice was served. And so, Part 4 ends with the realization that the fight had escalated to a direct confrontation. The HOA had pushed the limits, challenging my property rights, but I had countered with strategy, preparation, and composure. The stage was set for a more dramatic showdown, where the true extent of knowledge, patience, and determination would be tested. The following week felt heavier than any other since I'd moved in. Karen and the HOA had clearly realized that subtle intimidation and letters weren't working. Their tone in emails became sharper, their visits more calculated. I knew we were heading toward a real showdown, one that would test my preparation, patience, and courage. It all started with a formal notice that arrived one morning, delivered by certified mail. The envelope was thick, filled with legal language, fines, and repeated demands for compliance. The letter claimed multiple violations related to my dock, lake use, and landscaping, stating that failure to comply could result in escalating penalties, including legal action and potential liens. I read it calmly, line by line, checking every claim against my property deed, HOA bylaws, and previous correspondence. Almost every accusation was either exaggerated or false. But the tone was aggressive, designed to provoke anxiety. It was clear they wanted a reaction, a misstep that could be used against me. I took a deep breath. Panic wouldn't help. Preparation would. I immediately contacted my attorney, sharing every document, letter, and photo I had collected. Together, we reviewed every potential loophole the HOA might exploit. We outlined a plan for response, making sure every step I took would strengthen my legal position and protect my property rights. I felt a strange mix of tension and empowerment. I was ready, and I knew it. That afternoon, Karen arrived again, this time with 2 additional board members. She carried the certified notice in her hand, her posture formal, her expression carefully controlled. "We need to discuss your violations immediately," she said, her voice tight with authority. I invited them inside, maintaining calm. "I've reviewed the notice, and I'm confident that all aspects of my property are in compliance," I said. "I'm happy to go through the points one by one, using the documentation I've prepared." The group followed me to the lake, clipboard and pen in hand. I could feel their tension. They expected me to be nervous, defensive, or unprepared. Instead, I calmly presented my evidence: photographs, survey maps, property deeds, and notes from previous inspections. I explained each point in simple, factual language, highlighting the clauses that clearly demonstrated my compliance. Karen tried to interrupt at several points, but I remained steady, answering each objection with clarity and evidence. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, realizing that their standard intimidation tactics were ineffective. It was a quiet battle of authority, their assumed power against my preparation and confidence. As we moved around the dock area, I demonstrated how every improvement and addition complied fully with the property deed and local regulations. I even pointed out areas where the HOA's own rules were vague or contradictory, subtly highlighting their overreach without being confrontational. At one point, Karen leaned closer, her voice low but sharp. "You need to understand," she said, "resistance could cost you. Legal fees, fines, and ongoing disputes can become a serious burden." I looked her in the eye and replied firmly, "I'm aware of the risks, and I've prepared accordingly. But I will not be intimidated or coerced into surrendering my rights. Everything I've done is legal, and I have documentation to prove it." For a moment, silence filled the space. The lake reflected the afternoon sun, calm and undisturbed, while Karen and her team appeared unsettled. It was as if they realized that their usual methods, threats, subtle intimidation, and aggressive posturing, were ineffective against someone who knew the rules, had evidence, and remained composed under pressure. After what felt like an eternity, Karen straightened, her expression unreadable. "We'll be reviewing this further," she said coldly. "But know that we are serious about enforcing HOA rules." I nodded politely. "And I will continue to cooperate fully, within my legal rights," I replied. Once they left, I let out a deep breath, the tension that had been building for days finally easing slightly. But I knew the battle was far from over. Karen and the HOA would return with new strategies, perhaps even legal actions designed to drain my time and resources. I had to remain vigilant. The next few days were a mix of monitoring, strategizing, and maintaining composure. I reviewed all emails, notes, and documents carefully, ensuring that any future interactions would further strengthen my position. I also communicated discreetly with supportive neighbors, who had begun to recognize Karen's tactics and offer quiet encouragement. Their support was invaluable, giving me a sense of solidarity that I hadn't expected. Then came the most critical moment, a scheduled formal HOA meeting where they intended to present their case regarding alleged violations. I knew attending could be risky. They might try to trap me into making statements that could be misinterpreted or used against me. But I also knew avoiding the meeting would give them an advantage, making it seem as though I had something to hide. I prepared meticulously. I organized all documentation, notes, photographs, and legal references. I rehearsed how I would present my points clearly and calmly. Most importantly, I focused on maintaining composure, ensuring that every word I spoke reinforced the reality. I was in full compliance, and I would not be intimidated. The day of the meeting arrived, and tension filled the room. Karen opened the session, presenting the HOA's claims in a confident, polished manner. She expected to see nervousness, uncertainty, or confusion in my eyes. Instead, I stood firm, responding to each claim with clear, factual evidence. Every point she raised was met with documentation, calm explanation, or legal clarification. By the middle of the meeting, the atmosphere had shifted. Some board members began nodding subtly, perhaps realizing the strength of my position. Others exchanged uneasy glances, silently acknowledging that the intimidation tactics were failing. Karen, however, maintained her composure, though the sharpness in her tone had softened slightly. Finally, I summarized my position. "I respect the HOA and the need for community rules," I said. "But the lake, dock, and surrounding property are fully compliant with legal and HOA guidelines. All documentation supports this, and I am prepared to continue cooperating within my rights." The room fell silent. Karen tried to respond, but the room's energy had shifted. The strength of evidence, clarity of presentation, and calm confidence had created a turning point. For the first time, it felt like the balance of power had shifted. When the meeting concluded, Karen and the board left without further comment. I knew they would be back, they never gave up, but I had clearly established that I was prepared, knowledgeable, and unafraid. That night, sitting by the lake, I allowed myself a quiet sense of victory. The confrontation had been intense, the stakes high, but I had faced the HOA head-on and held my ground. Knowledge, preparation, and composure had turned what could have been a stressful and intimidating situation into a demonstration of control and confidence. I realized then that this battle wasn't just about property or rules, it was about standing up for yourself, knowing your rights, and refusing to let intimidation dictate your life. Karen and the HOA had tested me, but I had proven that patience, strategy, and clarity were more powerful than aggression. Part 5 closes with the understanding that the first real showdown had been survived. The HOA had attempted their most aggressive, formal challenge yet, but my preparation and confidence had neutralized their tactics. The stage was set for the next phase of the story, where strategy, subtle maneuvering, and neighborhood dynamics would play an even larger role in solidifying my control and exposing the HOA's overreach. After surviving the formal confrontation with the HOA, I thought I might finally get some breathing room. I was wrong. Karen and her team were nothing if not persistent. If intimidation through letters, meetings, and psychological tactics hadn't worked, they would try something subtler. Backdoor strategies designed to pressure me through neighbors, community opinion, and constant observation. The first sign came unexpectedly. One morning, I noticed small footprints and tire marks near the edge of the property, places where no visitors had been. At first, I hesitated, unsure if I was overreacting. But it quickly became clear, the HOA had sent someone to surveil the property quietly. They weren't there to discuss rules or violations, they were gathering evidence, hoping to find even the smallest infraction to use against me. I stayed calm. I didn't confront them immediately. Instead, I began documenting everything. I started a log of dates, times, and suspicious activity. I even adjusted my camera system, adding new angles and coverage to ensure that every inch of the property, especially the lake and dock, was recorded. If the HOA wanted proof of wrongdoing, they would find only what was legal and compliant. At the same time, I noticed a subtle shift among some neighbors. A few who had previously been friendly now seemed hesitant to speak. Others whispered when I walked by. I learned later that Karen had been actively discussing the situation, framing me as difficult and non-compliant. It was clear that she was trying to isolate me socially, make me feel vulnerable, and pressure me into submission without ever addressing me directly. Rather than being intimidated, I decided to use this to my advantage. I spoke privately with supportive neighbors, explaining the situation calmly and objectively. I shared the facts, my rights, the HOA overreach, and the documentation I had. Slowly, a small group of neighbors began to understand the reality. They weren't just sympathetic, they became allies, subtly countering any false narrative spread by Karen. One morning, Karen and 2 board members showed up again, this time casually, almost as if they were just passing by. But I knew better. Their casual demeanor was a tactic to make me appear paranoid or unreasonable if I reacted. I stayed outside, observing them, and waited for them to approach. Karen smiled as she approached. "I thought we'd check in again," she said. "Just making sure everything is in order." I greeted her politely. "Everything is in order," I said, keeping my voice calm. "If you'd like, I can show you the documentation that confirms compliance with every HOA rule." Her smile faltered slightly. She glanced at her companions, then back at me. "I'm sure everything is fine," she said carefully, her tone measured. "But you never know what might be overlooked." I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I pointed to the cameras I had recently installed. "All activities are being documented," I said. "If there's anything you think might be an issue, it will be captured. Transparency is important to me." Her expression changed in that moment. I could see a flash of frustration. Their backdoor tactics were meeting resistance. Every move they made, I had anticipated, and every attempt to unsettle me was neutralized by preparation and calm. The next few days were tense. I noticed HOA members lingering near the property at odd hours, taking photographs from a distance, and occasionally asking neighbors questions. Karen was trying to create an environment where I would feel watched, pressured, and isolated. But I refused to be intimidated. I kept detailed records, maintained calm interactions, and continued to quietly gather support from neighbors who understood the truth. Then came a more aggressive move. Karen sent a letter suggesting that my use of the lake and dock somehow created a community hazard. The language was vague but threatening, implying that the HOA could involve legal authorities if I didn't take corrective action. It was clearly designed to create anxiety and prompt a hasty reaction. I read the letter carefully, noting every word. Then I calmly drafted a response. I included clear photographs showing the dock, lake, and surrounding area were safe and fully compliant. I cited legal clauses, local regulations, and previous correspondence with the HOA. I sent it certified, ensuring there was a documented trail. My response was firm, professional, and unflappable. Karen didn't give up. Within days, she attempted another tactic, scheduling a neighborhood inspection under the guise of community safety. I was prepared. I invited her and the other board members onto my property at a scheduled time, ensuring I had evidence of everything. I walked them through the lake, dock, and property boundaries, calmly answering questions and pointing out full compliance. Their efforts to catch me off guard or gather incriminating evidence failed. Through all this, I learned an important lesson. Backdoor tactics and neighborhood pressure only work if the target allows fear, doubt, or frustration to take control. By staying prepared, calm, and transparent, I could neutralize intimidation while demonstrating integrity. The HOA's attempts to manipulate the situation were visible to anyone paying attention, and I made sure supportive neighbors saw the truth. By the end of the week, Karen's usual aura of authority was clearly diminished. Her subtle surveillance and attempts at social isolation had not produced the desired effect. Instead, my preparation, calm demeanor, and strategic communication had turned her tactics against her. She still persisted, of course, but every action she took now carried the risk of being exposed as overreach. Sitting by the lake that evening, I reflected on the week's events. The HOA had escalated to backdoor tactics, trying to pressure me through subtle surveillance and neighborhood influence. But I had turned each attempt into a demonstration of preparedness, transparency, and control. The water was calm, reflecting the setting sun, and for a moment, I allowed myself to breathe. I knew the battle was far from over. Karen and the HOA were persistent, creative, and determined. But I also knew that by staying calm, organized, and aware, I could continue to protect my property and maintain control. Every attempt they made to intimidate me, manipulate neighbors, or create stress only highlighted their overreach. Part 6 ends with the understanding that HOA tactics were evolving, but so was my strategy. Surveillance, social pressure, and subtle intimidation were all challenges I was prepared to meet with patience, evidence, and composure. The next phase of the story would continue to test their limits, ultimately setting the stage for a decisive turning point. After weeks of careful observation and strategic responses, it was clear that Karen and the HOA were becoming increasingly desperate. Their usual tactics, intimidation, psychological pressure, subtle surveillance, were proving ineffective. But desperation has a way of leading people to make mistakes, and I had been waiting for the right moment to turn the tables. It started with a notice slipped under my door one morning. Unlike previous letters, this one was unusually aggressive and sloppy. It demanded immediate compliance with rules that were either non-existent or clearly misinterpreted. The letter threatened fines, legal action, and public shaming within the neighborhood. Reading it, I realized they had grown careless. In their frustration, they had overstepped, creating a golden opportunity. I carefully documented the letter, photographing it, noting the date and time, and keeping a copy in my growing file of evidence. This was exactly what I needed, a tangible record of overreach, written in black and white, that could expose their tactics as unfair and illegal. That afternoon, Karen and 2 board members appeared at the property, seemingly unaware that their sloppy letter had created leverage against them. They carried clipboards and attempted to maintain their composure, but I could sense tension beneath the surface. They were trying to act professional, but their desperation was visible in subtle ways. Tight jaws, nervous glances, and clipped speech. "Good afternoon," Karen said, her voice slightly forced. "We're here to ensure compliance with HOA rules. We need access to the dock and surrounding area." I met her gaze steadily. "Of course," I replied calmly, "but I also want to clarify that your most recent notice contains several inaccuracies. Before we proceed, I would appreciate reviewing this together." Her eyes flicked briefly to the letter in my hand, then back to me. "What do you mean?" she asked cautiously. I held up the document. "This notice lists violations that either do not exist or are misinterpreted based on the HOA rules. I've documented everything and am happy to review it point by point. I want to ensure clarity and fairness, not confusion or intimidation." Karen hesitated. One of the other board members muttered something under their breath, but I could see that she was realizing she had misstepped. Their usual strategy of vague threats and carefully worded intimidation had backfired. This letter, intended to pressure me, had instead highlighted their overreach. We walked the property together, as I calmly explained each alleged violation. I presented photographs, legal references, and notes from previous inspections. Every point in the notice was either inaccurate or unsupported. I spoke clearly, keeping my tone neutral but firm. My documentation left little room for argument. At one point, Karen attempted to argue about the dock, claiming that its construction violated unspecified community guidelines. I pointed to the deed, the survey, and the HOA rules. The dock is fully compliant, I said. There is no clause granting the HOA authority to demand alterations here. Everything meets legal and safety standards. The board members exchanged uneasy glances. I could see that the confidence they normally wielded as authority figures was cracking. For the first time, I realized that the power dynamic had shifted. Calm preparation and evidence had begun to outweigh intimidation and assumed authority. The next major misstep came a few days later. Karen sent out an email to the neighborhood, implying that I was difficult to work with and that my property might be a hazard. This email was poorly worded and contained multiple inaccuracies. More importantly, it went out to every resident, creating a trail that could be scrutinized. I immediately saw the opportunity. I documented the email, noting the misleading language and the false implications. I then sent a professional, calm response to the same distribution list, clarifying facts and providing evidence of compliance. I didn't attack Karen personally. I stuck to the facts, presenting documents, photographs, and legal references. The result was immediate. Supportive neighbors began responding privately, thanking me for clarifying the situation. Some expressed surprise at the inaccuracies in Karen's email. Slowly, I could feel the community's perception shifting. Karen had attempted to manipulate public opinion, but her careless approach had exposed her overreach instead. I also began to leverage this in my communications with the HOA directly. I scheduled a formal meeting to review the letter and email, presenting all documentation in an organized binder. I made it clear that I expected professional and fair treatment, emphasizing transparency, legality, and neighborhood integrity. Every word was calm, every explanation backed by evidence. Karen and her team showed signs of frustration. Their usual tactics, threats, pressure, insinuations, were failing. I realized that they were now forced to respond within the confines of legality and transparency. They could no longer rely on fear or manipulation. My preparation had neutralized those strategies. Over the next few days, I noticed a remarkable change. Karen's visits became less frequent, her emails less aggressive. I continued documenting everything, but I could sense that the HOA was now cautious. They knew that any misstep could be used to expose their overreach and damage their credibility within the neighborhood. Sitting by the lake that evening, I reflected on the week's events. The critical misstep by Karen, the aggressive, inaccurate notice, and the poorly worded neighborhood email had shifted the balance. What had been a campaign of intimidation was now an opportunity to assert control, protect my property, and expose overreach. I realized that patience, preparation, and calm had created the leverage I needed to turn the situation around. This was a turning point. For weeks, the HOA had tried to control me through fear, manipulation, and neighborhood pressure. But in their desperation, they had made mistakes, critical mistakes that I could now use strategically. My documentation, legal support, and calm composure had transformed potential stress into power. The lake remained calm, the water reflecting the sunset in gold and pink hues. I allowed myself a small smile, knowing that I was no longer reacting defensively. I was now in control of the narrative. Karen and the HOA might continue to try, but every move they made would be measured against documented evidence and community awareness. Part 7 ends with the realization that the HOA's missteps had created a turning point. Aggressive, inaccurate notices and poorly managed communication had backfired, exposing overreach and giving the homeowner the upper hand. Preparation, transparency, and calm empowerment, setting the stage for the next phase, consolidating control and delivering justice. Strategy had transformed intimidation into. After weeks of back and forth, I could finally sense a subtle but powerful shift in the neighborhood dynamics. Karen and the HOA had made critical mistakes in their communications. Both the aggressive letter and the misleading neighborhood email, and the repercussions were beginning to show. Their overreach had not gone unnoticed, and now I had the opportunity to consolidate control over my property and set the record straight. It started with the neighbors. Many who had previously whispered in caution were now approaching me directly, sharing stories of their own minor conflicts with the HOA, and expressing gratitude that someone was standing up for their rights. I listened carefully, taking note of patterns in HOA behavior. Some neighbors were hesitant, worried about retaliation, but with calm reassurance and transparency, I began to earn their trust. This wasn't about confrontation, it was about exposing facts, creating understanding, and building credibility. I began by creating a clear, professional document that outlined every interaction with the HOA. Letters, emails, surprise visits, misinterpreted rules, and psychological tactics. I included dates, photos, legal references, and evidence of my compliance. The goal was simple: to provide a transparent record for any neighbor or authority who might question the situation. Karen, of course, didn't remain passive. She attempted subtle visits again, this time with less confidence. I noticed the tightness in her posture, the careful wording in her emails, and the hesitancy in her tone during interactions. She was beginning to realize that her previous tactics had backfired, and that I now had the upper hand in both knowledge and credibility. One afternoon, she arrived with 2 board members, claiming they wanted to clarify community concerns. I invited them to walk the property, calmly presenting my documentation and pointing out areas where the HOA had misinterpreted rules. I made it clear, without confrontation, that every action I had taken was legal, documented, and transparent. Karen attempted to regain control by highlighting minor, non-existent issues, but I calmly countered each point with evidence. "I understand your concerns," I said, keeping my tone neutral, "but here are the facts, the documentation, and the legal references that clarify this matter. I believe this resolves any misunderstanding." By the end of the visit, the tension had shifted. Karen's usual air of authority had diminished, replaced with visible frustration. The board members were quiet, some nodding subtly, acknowledging that the situation was now clearly documented and controlled. I realized that this consolidation wasn't just about legal rights, it was about demonstrating authority, knowledge, and fairness. Next, I focused on communication. I sent a clear, professional update to the neighborhood, outlining facts about my property, the lake, the dock, and compliance with HOA regulations. I did not attack Karen or the HOA personally. I simply presented documented evidence, transparent explanations, and an invitation for neighbors to verify facts if they wished. The response was immediate and positive. Supportive neighbors reached out, offering encouragement and sharing their own observations. This wasn't just about proving a point, it was about building community trust and exposing the HOA's overreach. Karen had attempted to manipulate perceptions, but by providing clear, factual communication, I neutralized misinformation and turned community awareness into an asset. During the following week, I continued to monitor HOA activity. They attempted subtle tactics, checking the property at odd hours, asking neighbors questions. But now I had full documentation, cameras, and records. Every attempt they made to intimidate or gather false evidence only reinforced the narrative of their overreach. I remained calm, composed, and strategic, refusing to react emotionally. One particularly revealing moment came when Karen tried to rally other homeowners against me, citing vague claims about community disruption. I invited her to review the documentation in person. With evidence of compliance, clear records of communication, and neighborhood support, the attempt to rally opposition fell flat. The HOA's credibility was weakening, while my position was strengthening. I also began to leverage strategic communication to clarify rules, document compliance, and expose inconsistencies. Every interaction with the HOA was carefully recorded, and every letter, email, or visit became part of a structured narrative that demonstrated both fairness on my part and overreach on theirs. By the end of the week, the shift was undeniable. Karen's presence became more cautious, her attempts at intimidation less frequent. Neighbors, previously hesitant or uncertain, now recognized the transparency and legitimacy of my actions. The balance of power had clearly shifted. Sitting by the lake that evening, I reflected on the past few weeks. What had begun as subtle intimidation and psychological pressure had escalated into a sustained battle of strategy, patience, and evidence-based action. I had not only protected my property and rights but had also exposed HOA overreach in a way that was transparent, factual, and community-oriented. I realized that control wasn't about confrontation. It was about knowledge, preparation, and calm execution. Karen had attempted to manipulate, intimidate, and isolate me, but each misstep she made was documented, exposed, and countered with strategic clarity. By maintaining composure and transparency, I had turned the HOA's tactics against them, consolidating control over both my property and the narrative. Part 8 closes with the understanding that HOA overreach can be countered effectively through patience, documentation, and strategic communication. The homeowner has shifted from defense to empowerment, exposing missteps, gaining neighborhood support, and solidifying control. The story is approaching its climax, where justice and resolution will finally be achieved. By the start of the next week, the balance of power in the neighborhood had shifted. Karen and the HOA were no longer operating with the confidence they once had. Their attempts to intimidate, manipulate, and pressure me had not only failed, they had become visible missteps that undermined their credibility. I could feel it in the air. The HOA was on the defensive, and the momentum had shifted firmly in my favor. The tipping point came when I received confirmation that the letters, emails, and neighborhood notices Karen had sent, those filled with exaggerations, misinterpretations, and misleading claims, were being reviewed by legal counsel within the HOA itself. It seemed that someone higher up in the association was finally recognizing that Karen's aggressive approach could expose the HOA to liability. I decided that this was the moment to act decisively. I scheduled a formal meeting with the HOA board, inviting them to review all documentation I had collected over the past weeks. My goal was clear: present irrefutable evidence, maintain calm authority, and allow the facts to speak for themselves. When the day of the meeting arrived, Karen appeared with several board members, carrying folders and attempting to appear composed. I could sense the tension. Their usual aura of control was noticeably diminished. I greeted them politely and began presenting my organized binder of evidence, which included photographs, legal references, dates of interactions, copies of letters and emails, and documentation showing full compliance with HOA regulations. Karen attempted to interject multiple times, trying to argue minor points or cast doubt. I calmly acknowledged her concerns, then referred back to the documented evidence. Each point she raised was met with a factual, neutral, and precise response. The effect was immediate. Her arguments became weaker under the weight of irrefutable documentation, while my calm, evidence-based presentation reinforced my credibility. During the meeting, it became clear that some board members were uncomfortable with Karen's aggressive tactics. They began quietly nodding, recognizing that her approach had created unnecessary tension, legal risk, and community dissatisfaction. I noticed subtle signs of internal conflict among the board: uncertainty, frustration, and the realization that Karen's strategy had backfired. After an hour of careful review, one of the board members finally spoke up. "It appears that many of these claims against your property are unfounded. The documentation provided is thorough and seems to confirm compliance with all HOA regulations." Karen's face tightened. She attempted to regain control, but the momentum had shifted decisively. Every argument she had used to intimidate me was now exposed as overreach. The board could no longer rely on fear or manipulation. They were faced with facts, documentation, and the visible support of neighbors who had witnessed her tactics. I remained calm, responding with clarity. I respect the HOA and the need for community rules, but all actions regarding my property have been transparent, documented, and fully compliant. I hope this resolves any misunderstandings and demonstrates the importance of fair and factual review in future interactions. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that Karen had lost credibility. The HOA board recognized the overreach, the inaccuracies in communication, and the risks of continuing aggressive tactics. They agreed to formally acknowledge that my property was in compliance, and that any previous missteps or notices sent under Karen's direction were nullified. The next morning, I noticed a subtle but meaningful change in neighborhood dynamics. Supportive neighbors reached out, expressing relief and admiration for how I had handled the situation. Even those who had initially been uncertain were now acknowledging the fairness, preparation, and transparency that had guided my actions. Karen's influence had waned. Her attempts at manipulation, intimidation, and misinformation were clearly recognized as overreach. Around the same time, I received formal confirmation from the HOA that my property was officially compliant, and that any previous fines, threats, or claims were rescinded. The HOA would also be conducting internal reviews of their communications to ensure such overreach did not happen in the future. It was a public vindication, not only for me, but for the principle that homeowners have rights and can stand up against intimidation when armed with preparation, knowledge, and composure. Sitting by the lake that evening, I reflected on the journey. Weeks of psychological games, aggressive letters, surveillance, neighborhood pressure, and formal challenges had all tested my patience, resilience, and strategy. But each challenge had been met with calm preparation, meticulous documentation, and clear communication. I had not reacted impulsively, and in doing so, I had turned the tables on an overreaching HOA. The satisfaction wasn't just in protecting my property. It was in exposing the system of overreach, manipulation, and intimidation that Karen had relied on. By remaining composed, transparent, and strategic, I had achieved something larger: accountability, fairness, and recognition of the homeowner's rights. I realized that this was the ultimate lesson of the ordeal. Knowledge, preparation, and composure are more powerful than fear and intimidation. Facts and evidence cannot be easily dismissed, and calm authority can neutralize even the most aggressive tactics. The HOA had underestimated me, but by responding strategically and methodically, I had gained the upper hand, restored fairness, and ensured justice was served. The days following the HOA's formal acknowledgement of compliance were calm, almost surreal. After weeks of tension, intimidation, and strategic maneuvering, the air around my property had changed. Karen and her aggressive tactics had lost their power. The HOA board, having recognized overreach, was now cautious and measured in any interactions. For the first time since moving in, I felt a genuine sense of peace. I took my mornings by the lake seriously, sitting with a cup of coffee and reflecting on how much had happened. Each ripple on the water seemed to mirror the tension that had finally settled. It wasn't just the physical control over my property that mattered, it was the mental and emotional space I had reclaimed. For weeks, every letter, every visit, and every whispered comment from neighbors had felt like a test. Now, I realized I had passed, and not merely survived, I had won. The victory wasn't loud or dramatic. There were no grand celebrations, no public confrontation. The power came quietly, through preparation, documentation, and calm composure. I had faced repeated intimidation, psychological pressure, and attempts at social isolation, and I had handled each challenge strategically. Each move I made was deliberate, each response measured, and each action backed by evidence. Neighborhood dynamics began to normalize. Supportive neighbors now openly acknowledged the fairness of my actions, sharing appreciation and quiet congratulations. Even those who had been unsure or hesitant before began to see the truth. Standing up for your rights, when done with preparation and integrity, commands respect. I could sense a subtle shift in community perception, where fairness and transparency were valued over intimidation and control. Karen, predictably, still lingered at the edges of interactions, but the aura of dominance she once projected had vanished. Her attempts at manipulation were now carefully scrutinized by both the HOA board and neighbors alike. Every move she made could be countered by facts, evidence, and calm reasoning. The psychological power she once wielded had been neutralized. I spent time reflecting on the lessons learned. One of the most important realizations was that control doesn't come from aggression or intimidation. It comes from knowledge, preparation, and the ability to remain calm under pressure. The HOA had tried every tactic in the book: psychological games, letters, legal threats, neighborhood manipulation, and surveillance. Yet none of these worked against a homeowner who stayed composed, documented meticulously, and responded with transparency. Another lesson was the value of community awareness. By engaging with neighbors openly, sharing factual information, and demonstrating transparency, I turned potential isolation into a support network. I didn't need to rally the neighborhood through confrontation. I simply needed to present facts and allow people to see the truth for themselves. Legally, my position was now solid. The HOA's aggressive notices and threats had been formally invalidated. Any future claims would be scrutinized against the documentation and evidence I had accumulated. I had created a permanent record, not just for myself, but as a precedent for fair treatment and accountability in the community. Emotionally, I felt stronger than ever. The sense of empowerment came from understanding that fear and manipulation only have power if you allow them to. By refusing to react impulsively, staying composed, and preparing thoroughly, I had turned each challenge into an opportunity. Even the most subtle intimidation could be countered with patience, knowledge, and strategy. Sitting by the lake one late afternoon, watching the sun dip into the water, I allowed myself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The property, the dock, the lake, everything I had worked to protect, was secure. But more importantly, I had learned how to navigate conflict, assert my rights, and maintain personal integrity under pressure. I thought about Karen one last time. Her attempts at control and intimidation had failed because she underestimated the power of preparation and composure. She relied on fear, manipulation, and assumed authority. I had relied on facts, patience, and calm strategy. The contrast was clear, and in that clarity, I found satisfaction. The HOA, now more cautious and aware of boundaries, began interacting professionally. Their oversight became a formal, procedural presence rather than a personal threat. The letters stopped being aggressive, the surprise visits became official inspections only, and neighborhood whispers turned into neutral, supportive interactions. The environment around my property transformed from one of tension to one of mutual respect. Looking back, the journey had been intense and emotional, but it taught lessons far beyond property disputes. I learned about resilience, strategy, and the importance of calm in high-pressure situations. I learned that intimidation can be neutralized with preparation, and overreach can be exposed through patience and transparency. I learned that justice isn't always immediate or dramatic. It often comes quietly, through persistence and careful action. By the end of that month, life had returned to a peaceful rhythm. Mornings were spent by the lake, afternoons tending to the property, and evenings reflecting on the events that had tested every ounce of patience and composure I possessed. The dock remained intact, the lake serene, and the neighborhood aware that fairness and evidence-based action held more power than fear and manipulation. In the final reflection, I realized that the true victory wasn't just reclaiming control of my property, it was reclaiming my peace of mind. I had faced relentless pressure, intimidation, and manipulation, yet emerged stronger, wiser, and more confident. The HOA had attempted to assert control through fear, but I had achieved control through preparation, transparency, and integrity. As the sun set over the lake, casting a golden glow on the water, I felt a deep sense of accomplishment. The battle had been long, the stakes high, but I had proven that knowledge, patience, and calm authority are more powerful than aggression. The HOA had been exposed, boundaries had been respected, and I had secured both my property and my peace.